Shalom, Izzy here with Holy Language Institute at holylanguage.com. What do you think of this? Have you seen this language before? Hebrew, if you have, then you probably know that it reads from right to left, which is very different than English. And you may also be looking at some of these words and trying to figure out what passage this is. This is actually a translation of the New Testament into Biblical Hebrew. And it was done by Franz Delitzsch, who was a lover of the Jewish people and the Hebrew language back in the 1800s. Tons of Jewish people read his translation and saw Yeshua for who he was as a true Jew. This is a translation of, let's see if we can find it here, this, Romans chapter 11. And I wanted to show you one verse and unpack it with you a little bit. It's just burning in my heart today. So Paul is talking about some questions about the Jewish community, the nation of Israel. These are questions that came up in people's minds a couple thousand years ago, and there's still questions that come up today. And Paul's answers a couple thousand years ago are just as relevant today as they were back then. So this is one of the things he says. This is like one of these, it's kind of like cognitive dissonance. There was some like mental tension going on a couple thousand years ago, and that's still the case today. And before we even look at this verse, I'll tell you why. If you've read the book of the Maaseh HaShlichim, the Acts of Messiah's emissaries as apostles, then you've read some of the history of the early Yeshua movement, the early church, and you know that let's say Saul of Tarsus. Shaul, for instance, he would come into a city, he would go to synagogue because he was Jewish, and that's what Jews do on Shabbat. That's where, you get to hear the Torah read and all this stuff. And sometimes he would get an opportunity to talk about the Mashiach, the Messiah. And so sometimes that went over better than other times. Sometimes it started riots across the city and assassination attempts on him. And it was actually kind of a complex situation. I'm not going to go into all of that. But definitely there were cases where there were some Jewish people who were the most infuriated opponents of the story of Yeshua and the message that Shaul brought, and they really made themselves out to be enemies of the gospel, so to speak, and not just of the gospel, but of these people who became disciples of Yeshua, some of whom were Jewish and some of whom weren't Jewish, and so it tore whole congregations apart. Big brawls, so to speak, and that's just on the pages of the Book of Acts. If you read early church history, originally the early church was actually viewed as a sect of Judaism. You read that in the Book of Acts too. They were called the sect of the Nazarenes. The sect of what? Well, it was a sect of Judaism. And Judaism was a religion that was officially recognized by the Roman Empire. So if you were a Jew, you were entitled to certain freedoms. Like, for instance, you weren't obligated to worship idols or to say Caesar is Lord, because that was against your religion. And Rome tried to respect everybody's religions and just not mess with that. Originally the early Christians were viewed as a sect of Judaism, and they didn't, they had some legal immunity as a result. Now, over time, the Jewish community started saying, these guys, they're not one of us. These guys aren't Jewish at all. They're doing their own thing. They have a new religion, and we totally disassociate from them. And when that happened, the wrath of the Roman hammer of justice would sometimes fall on the early Christians. They were viewed as belonging to a cult, a new religious movement, and that was not legal. And that's often why the early Christians were brutally persecuted. So there were some strong feelings on both sides back in the olden days. The first couple of centuries after Yeshua of Nazareth walked the hills of Israel and taught what he taught. There was Jewish hatred of the early disciples of Yeshua. There was also early Christian hatred, sadly, against the Jewish community. There was tension. There was a very strong tension on both sides, and both sides often acted like they just wanted to get away from each other and be as separate as they could be. And, you can definitely see some of those strong anti-Jewish feelings in the writings of the early church fathers. I have a 10-volume series of the ante-Nicene church fathers, so all of the writings from the early church before the Council of Nicaea. And I'm reading through that, and it's interesting to definitely see some of those strong anti-Jewish sentiments expressed. It's also very sad, because those sentiments were not, they were, like, how can you express that stuff after having read Paul? And that's what we're going to look at right now, actually. And at the same time, you can see some of those same sentiments on the Jewish side. So, Scripture says that we love God because He first loved us, and I'm sure that there were early Christians who were saying, well, we hate the Jews because they first hated us, and maybe there were also Jews who were saying we hate those Christians because they first hated us. Thankfully, today, things are changing. There's a warm wind blowing, spiritually speaking, and is melting some of those glaciers. And there's a new openness on both Jewish and Christian sides to trying to understand each other and relate to each other, and at the same time not compromising who you are and not just being weak sauce, And I really do appreciate that, and that's I'd say a relatively new development, and it's a very beautiful time that we're living in, that is the case. So look at this. That's the historical background for Paul's words here. He says, from the standpoint of the gospel, they, referring to, national Israel, the Jewish community, they are enemies for your sake. But from the standpoint of God's choice, they are beloved for the sake of the fathers. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable, or maybe you would rather say irrevocable. Let's say it's both. All right. So notice this. Now Paul acknowledges that there's some enmity going on there, that there are some strong feelings on both sides, that there's a separation taking place. He says, when it comes to the gospel, they are enemies in terms of how they've treated you, and so Paul acknowledges that was the case a couple of thousand years ago. If you read early Christian Jewish polemics, they're really quite stomach turning, and it's sad just the degree of enmity that crept in and just how bitter enemies the early Jews and Christians became. I'm like I said, thankfully it's not. That's changing. Hopefully you're being part of that change, by the way. Hopefully you're more of an agent of love than of hatred. Maybe it's a good thing to ask yourself. But then he goes on to say, but from the standpoint of God's choice, they're beloved for the sake of their fathers. I wanted to show you what this would sound like in Hebrew. Paul, he was a Greek speaker for sure. He came from Tarsus, which was one of the biggest cities in the Roman Empire. But at the same time, he described himself as a Hebrew of Hebrews. And he grew up in Jerusalem learning from Gamaliel, who was one of the greatest Jewish sages of the era. And Rabban Gamliel is how Hazaken, Rabbi Gamaliel the elder is how he's referred to in Jewish literature. And he was very Jewish, and he never stopped being Jewish. He stood up before the crowds in Jerusalem and he said, I am a Jew. And this was, decades after his encounter with, Yeshua on his rampage to Damascus. So it's really helpful sometimes when you look at Paul's letters and you try and understand them from in their Jewish context, understanding that this guy was even if when he's communicating in Greek, he grew up like reading the Hebrew Bible and memorizing that thing, and you can definitely still see his Hebrew mindset all over his letters. And we have this series where we're studying through this Hebrew translation of the Epistle to the Romans, and that's one of our big objectives, is to try and set it in its original Jewish context and get right inside the Hebrew mind of the Apostle Paul. All right, so that's what we're doing as we read this translation of Romans. And so I wanted to look at that one verse with you. Maybe, I don't know what your experience of Hebrew has been, but hopefully this will be a good little taste of it for you. So he says, Han, that means it means yes, or, behold, bidvar. So in the word, or in the matter of habesorah, so that's a beautiful word. The gospel in Hebrew is the besorah. If you want to say it the more Israeli way, you'd say besorah. And the besorah, it's a message, usually a message of good news, but not all the time. It's a message, and it's good news. It's the gospel, right? So when it comes to that, oivim, so enemies. Maybe you've heard oi, or oive, or oy vavoy. It's all related to this Hebrew word for enemy. I don't know if you knew that. Oivim hem. Now, enemies are they biglalchem, on account of you. Uvidvar, and in the matter of habachira, that's the being chosen, the election, chavivim. So they're dearly loved. They're beloved. Hem are they biglal, on account of ha'avot, the avs, the fathers, and yeah, that includes both the patriarchs and the matriarchs of Israel. So Paul talked about two things here. He talked about being chosen, and he talked about being loved because of the fathers. Let's talk about that for a little bit, because it really helps us to understand some things about God and His heart, and it also helps us to understand His relationship with the Jewish community. Way back when in the olden days, and also today. So, firstly, he says he talks about them being chosen. That's a big theme. Everybody knows the Jews are God's chosen people. It is like this thing out there that it's this claim. The Jewish people claim to be God's chosen people. Where did that come from? And here's a big question. Let's say that I walked up to you and I was like, I choose you. You'd probably give me a really weird look, and you might even back away a little bit. Or you would you'd do this double take inside and you'd be like, what is he talking about? And some of that might depend on who you are, And I dare you to try this with a couple people and see what kind of responses you get. Maybe a family, like if you say this to your spouse, that's going to go over really well. They'd be like, oh, I choose you too. Very romantic, right? So do that. That's great. But really, you have to do that with someone else. You have to do that with another family member, or maybe a friend, or maybe even just a stranger. If you're really interested to watch a bare response, just walk up to someone and say, I choose you, and see what they do. Maybe the start of the greatest adventure of your life could be when you hear those words. It's the Matrix all over again. Are you being chosen for this special knowledge and for this secret mission or something? All kinds of things could go tumbling through your mind at that point. But one of the questions you'll probably have is, choose me for what? Okay, you choose me, oh, thanks. Bye. Or you're choosing me to what? You're choosing me for what? Being chosen isn't an end in of itself. And this is really relevant when it comes to this question of being God's chosen people. Okay, great. God chose you. God chose you to what? And sometimes, for those of us who are Jewish, maybe we don't ask ourselves that often enough. Or maybe we don't really let it sink in why God chose us as a people group. And that's the first thing that I want to talk with you a little bit here. Now, this is the context of Paul's words. Have you ever been to synagogue? If you've been to synagogue on a Saturday morning, you'll see that, they get out the Torah scroll, they unroll it at the front, and then they call 7 people to come up to the Torah. It's called making an aliyah, going up to read from the Torah. And maybe you can't read Hebrew, and that's okay. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to laugh at you as you were like, blah, 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 I don't know what to say. There's a reader, and the reader reads for you. So basically what you do is you go up, and you call the congregation to bless God with you, and then you say a blessing before the reading of the Torah, and a blessing after the reading of the Torah. And the blessing before the reading of the Torah that you say, I'll sing it for you, and then I'll tell you what it is in English. You say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim v'natan lanu et Torato, Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah. At which point everyone says, Amen. And I've heard this blessing hundreds and hundreds of times. If you're Jewish, if you grew up going to synagogue, you've literally heard this blessing 7 times every Saturday. So you do the math. 7 times roughly 50 Saturdays in a year, times how many years? Thousands of times. And maybe if you go to shul, you go to synagogue on for the weekday services on Monday or Thursday, then you hear it another 3 times during each of those sessions, right? So you hear this a lot, and if you're Jewish, then you say you praise God with this little prayer lots of times. What does it mean? Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe. That's like how every single Jewish prayer starts. Who has chosen us from the peoples. And has what? And has given us his Torah. Blessed are you, Lord, giver of the Torah. Amen. That's the blessing. So 7 times in a row on Saturday morning, Jewish people say, Praise you, God, for choosing us to receive the Torah. God, you chose us so you could give us the Torah. That's the answer. The Jews are God's chosen people to what? To receive the Torah. To keep writing Torah scrolls. Because guess what happens if you stop writing Torah scrolls? It all goes bye-bye and nobody has a Bible to read. And that's really bad news for the world. And yeah, like we do have, we live in the digital era now. And yeah, we did have the advent of the printing press, whatever, roughly half a millennium ago. But guess what? Before that, all the books and scrolls were written by hand. And if the Jewish people quit writing Torah scrolls, there just wouldn't be any more. And so, the Jewish community on a very basic level was just, God chose the Jewish community to write Torah scrolls and to read those things. Because guess what? There are no vowel pointings in the Torah scrolls. And unless you read that thing, you don't even know how to pronounce that stuff. So, to write Torah scrolls and to read Torah scrolls, and not just that, but to live the Torah scroll. God chose the Jewish community to keep the Torah. Now, guess what's really interesting? Historically speaking, in the last couple of thousand years, if there's a Jewish community in some city and they all quit doing that, they all quit writing Torah scrolls and reading the Torah scrolls and doing the Torah scrolls, it doesn't take very long before they're gone. There's no more Jewish community. They're just a memory in the collective memory of the city. Oh yeah, that building down the street, it used to be a synagogue and now it's not. Oh yeah, one of my great grandparents was Jewish and they're all gone now, Just a memory in the past, historical relic. Why? Because they quit keeping the Torah. There's this Jewish saying that it's not so much that we've kept the Sabbath as the Sabbath has kept us. And I think that's very true also of the Torah. It's not so much that Israel has kept the Torah in exile as the Torah has kept Israel. So there's this organic unity, there's this intimate bond between Israel and Torah. And so that's what Paul was talking about. When he talks about, the Jewish community was chosen, and so even if they're acting like your enemies, and they are, they're the enemies of the early Messianic community, the early church, they're still chosen. God chose them, and that hasn't stopped. And God chose them to what? He chose them to keep writing and reading and living out the Torah scroll. And guess what? Jewish people are still doing that today. That's a really important thing to understand. And Paul said that earlier too. It's not like that's a new idea. Romans chapter 3 verse 1. He says, well, what's the benefit of what's the benefit of being circumcised? What's the advantage of being Jewish? And then what he didn't say is, haven't you read my epistle to the Galatians? That's all done away with, and there's no benefit or advantage to being Jewish or circumcising your children. No, that's not what he said. He said much in every way. He said, firstly, that they've been entrusted with the oracles of God. What does that mean? That they receive the Torah. So that's what being Jewish is all about. It's about the Torah. And so, Paul says very clearly, it's not just that God gave Israel the Torah, God entrusted his Torah to the Jewish community. And that's still the case today. The Jewish community, they're the people who are, doing the Torah. Now, there is this movement that has just come up in the last couple of decades of non-Jewish believers in Yeshua. You could say Gentile Christians, or maybe you could say Messianic Christians. And they want to start keeping the Torah. Really, really fascinating. And definitely, I believe this is a real move of God, being drawn back to the ancient paths, realizing that the early church was Torah positive, not Torah negative, and that there's a real blessing in keeping the commandments of God. Paul wasn't being stupid and messing with people's heads when he said in Romans chapter 7, God's commandments are good. He was serious when he said that. He said God's law and his commandments, they're good and they're holy and they're righteous. Paul was serious. And, so there's this movement of Christians who are like, yeah, Paul was serious and we were experiencing it for ourselves. The joy of not being a workaholic and taking Saturday off to spend with God and family. Celebrating Shabbat, keeping the feasts, eating clean, stuff like that, So there's this movement, and it's really important if you're part of that movement to recognize that this is still true. The Jews are still God's chosen people. God chose the Jewish community to receive the Torah. He entrusted it with them. And so if you want to start keeping the Torah, great, but recognize that you are grafted in. Recognize that you are coming alongside the Jewish community, and recognize that God did not give you as an individual the law. God gave his law to the Jewish community. So, respect that. Respect the way the Jewish community historically has interpreted commandments. Respect how the Torah is handled in the Jewish world. And please don't just make up your own Torah. Because, there was that era in Israel's history when everybody did what was right in their own eyes. That wasn't a good thing. So don't do that. All right? All right, so that's the first thing I wanted to share with you here. Just that, the Jewish people were still chosen. And then secondly, he says they're loved. Why? On account of the avot, which is like, the forefathers and the foremothers. Now, it works when you talk about the mothers, because there were literally four mothers: Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. The four mothers, we really should be referring to them as the three fathers, don't you think? Because, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the three fathers and the four mothers. Oh man, okay. I know you probably can tell I'm being a little bit humorous there, but the big idea here. Let's go back to the English text of this. The big idea here is God says they're still dear to God's heart. He still loves them. They still experience expressions of the love of God, in their individual lives and as a community. Why? Because of who they are? Because of what they've done? Because of their behaviors? Absolutely not. It's because they're family. It's because they are the descendants of God's friends to whom he made forever promises. Here's like a very, very simple one. God told Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob over and over and over again, hey, this land of Canaan, you're going to have a bunch of kids, and they're going to become a nation, and they're going to live there forever. This is going to be their home forever. So, to keep that promise, God had to do two things. He had to make sure that they never all died out, that the nation of Israel never died out. And then secondly, he had to ensure that even if they got kicked out of the land temporarily because they were being bad, they had to come back. And that wasn't just, it's not like the coming of Jesus just magically made all of God's forever promises, poof, go away. That's really obvious if you read the whole New Testament, like all the verses. Like if you read Paul, for instance. Those promises are forever. God said, your descendants are going to live here forever. And that helps us to understand some stuff that's happened in the last couple hundred years and understand some stuff that's happening with the Jewish world today. You read about Zionism. I love the history of Zionism. In the mid-1800s, there were Jewish people who started saying, hey, Europe isn't our home. We should go back to Israel. That's our home. We would actually be safe there, a lot safer. Theodor Herzl, for instance, he's sometimes referred to as the father of modern Zionism. It's basically what he said. Eliezer ben Yehuda, you could see that he was the father of, the modern Hebrew language. He said something very similar. It's really fascinating reading the life of Eliezer ben Yehuda. If you haven't done that, I definitely encourage you to do that. He was older than Theodor Herzl, and in my opinion, he was a prophetic voice. He did have a point where he claimed that he heard the audible voice of God. And that's what gave him his life mission, to see the Hebrew language restored as the language of the Jewish people who were going back to Israel. Very miraculous, his life. Even the fact that he had tuberculosis for how long? Like decades, and he should have died, and he didn't die until he completed his mission of restoring the Hebrew languages, the modern language of the Jewish people. You look at these guys' lives, and here's the thing. They were rejected by the Orthodox Jewish community for the most part because they weren't religious. Like Theodor Herzl, his Judaism, he knew almost squat of Judaism. He was a very secular Jew. Eliezer ben Yehuda, he wasn't religious. Yeah, he did keep kosher and a couple other things, like after he moved to Israel so that he could better interface with the Orthodox Jewish community. He wasn't religious either. You're not even sure if these guys believed in God the way, fundamentalists believe in God. And yet at the same time, they were voices for the return of the Jewish people to the land of Israel. And in my opinion, God used them mightily to start something. And the state of Israel was reborn. And yes, that was a miracle. Statistically, that should not have happened. And, even if it did, and then, you see the wars that happened after, the 67 war, for instance. Statistically, Israel should have been wiped out at that point, and they weren't. Right. So anyways, there's some very miraculous stuff that went on in the early Zionist movement and in the early state of Israel. And it would be easy for us to look at that and be like, well, that can't have been God because these were messed up people. They didn't even believe in God. They weren't faithful to the Torah. They weren't religious Jews. Look at Israel today. Look at how they treat the Palestinians. It would be easy to say certain things and to say clearly God would have nothing to do with such people. This was just a secular movement. It was not spiritual at all. And Paul says, hold on just a moment. God made promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob a long time ago. And he's going to keep those promises. And he's not going to keep them because of who the Jewish people are right now. Maybe they're even make themselves out to be God's enemies or enemies of, the remnant of Israel or believers in Yeshua. But that doesn't mean that God is just going to walk away from them and stop keeping his promises. So, from that perspective, the history of Israel in the last couple hundred years is a story that glorifies God for his faithfulness to his covenant relationship and to the promises that he made thousands of years ago. And that's what Paul said too. So maybe that helps you to understand some things about, Israel in the last couple hundred years. Even the Jewish community today, I belong to a conservative Jewish synagogue, so I'll say this as we don't have it all together. I know of a conservative synagogue, and the rabbi didn't even believe in God. He didn't believe that the Torah was historically true. Anything before David, basically, it was just stuff that people made up. This was a conservative rabbi. I know of another synagogue that had a lesbian rabbi, and this was a conservative synagogue. So, if you're coming from like a fundamentalist Bible-believing background, you hear about that, and you're like, how can God have anything to do with these people? Clearly, they don't have any kind of relationship with him, and so he doesn't have any kind of relationship with them. And that's where Paul comes in and he says, hold on just a moment. Yeah, there's a hardening that has happened, and yes, it's partial and it's temporary, and there's a reason for that, and that reason is you, so salvation can come to the nations. The fullness of the Gentiles has to come in first. And he says, and they may be even their enemies, but God still loves them. He's still dear to their heart. He's not done with them. And even though they might not even want to have a relationship with him, sometimes God says, but I have a relationship with you. And that's not going to go away. Why? Because the gifts of God and his calling, they're not things he's going to take back. They're irrevocable. So maybe that helps you to understand a little bit God's heart and God's relationship today with the nation of Israel as a whole, with the Jewish community out there in the diaspora, maybe even the synagogue in your city, down the street or whatever. Maybe some of if you know Jewish people, maybe this helps you to see how God sees those people. Maybe you have a Jewish family member, friend, neighbor, coworker. Maybe now you have a better sense of just how God feels about those people and how he looks at them and what the basis is upon which he relates to them. So anyways, hopefully this has raised some questions in your mind. Hopefully it's helped you to better understand the context of Paul's words and just his answers to some of these, the situation that can definitely, at face value, cause some cognitive dissonance and be pretty confusing. Hopefully this has warmed your heart with the love of God for the nation of Israel and for everybody. Thanks for joining me in this little chat. This was actually just a takeaway from my most recent study I did. We're doing these Hebrew verses studies, reading through verses in Hebrew, just like the name suggests. Right now we're going through Romans. We've gone through Genesis and we've gone through Matthew in the past. Now we're going through Romans. And like I said, we're just trying to really understand the underlying Hebraic fabric of the epistles of the Apostle Paul. If you'd like to learn more with me and with our community, I'd love to have you. Come see us at holylanguage.com, and you can get the full lesson reading through through Romans chapter 11 and talking in greater depth about some of these questions and details. So again, come see us at holylanguage.com, and thanks for joining me in this little conversation. Hope it brought a smile to your face.